Do you ever find reclined twist alignment cues in yoga to be confusing? I know that I definitely have, and that's partly because we tend to hear a lot of varying cues about what to do with our shoulders, what to do with our hips when we're in reclined twists. So, today, let's just take a bit of a closer look at reclined twists and just some of the anatomy and directions of movement involved to hopefully offer a little more sense of clarity about what's going on in our reclined twists and about the varying cues that we might hear. So, the plan for today is to first talk about leg positioning in reclined twists and just the varying ways you can position your legs in a twist and why. And then we'll talk about this semi common cue that we tend to hear in a reclined twist, which is to scoot your hips over to one side or bump the hips to the side before you come into your twist. So we'll look at what's up with that. Why would we want to or not want to do that? And then lastly, we'll take a quick look at the shoulders in reclined twists. So let's take a look at the different options we have for leg positioning in reclined twists. So I find that there are basically three main leg variations that we tend to see in reclined twists. And the first, and in my experience, kind of the most classic variation, is just both knees bent, and then the knees are stacked, and we take the legs over to the side. So I feel like this is a great just kind of starting place for a reclined twist. It's just pretty classic. I took my legs over, and that means my pelvis came along, and that resulted in this rotation happening in my spine. So this is kind of like your maybe quote your classic or your basic recline twist leg position. But then there's the option that we kind of often see where maybe we bend only one knee, the other leg stays straight, and then we take this single leg across. So, what's up with this? Why is this different than both knees straight? And what I see happening here, what I see as the major difference is that when you don't have the legs stacked, the bottom leg is straight, then this top leg actually has more room to move. And because of that, the goes down further, that pulls the pelvis further, and that will end up in more spinal rotation. So this variation can create more rotation in the spine compared to this variation where the legs are stacked. And another consideration for the single leg variation is we also get a little more, we potentially, it'll kind of depend on each person, but we potentially get a little more hip adduction or adduction. So that's when your thigh moves across midline. And in this particular position, it's technically horizontal adduction, but we might get a little more of that without the bottom leg in the picture. So the top leg has more room to adduct at the hip, horizontally adduct, and then we get more spinal rotation. And then a third variation that we tend to see would be a straight top leg. So the top leg stays straight and then it comes over. So, what's up with this variation? How is it different from the knee bent or both knees bent? And what I see here is that with this leg straight, we probably can all relate to feeling that this will bring on more of an outer thigh and hip stretch, more of an IT band stretch to have the knee straight. So we kind of add that element into the reclined twist. So then we've got spinal rotation happening for sure. It's a twist, but we also have this distinct mobilization happening across the outer thigh when we straighten that knee. So there's that. But yeah, also, if we compare it to the bent knee, to the single leg bent knee, if we straighten the leg, you might have noticed that rolled my pelvis back a little bit more. So I wasn't in as deep of rotation. So by straightening the leg, you back out a little more compared to the top knee bent variation. So maybe a little less spinal rotation here, but still, a good amount. And then some IT band stretch. And then a final, just kind of fourth variation that I might throw in there. I know I said there were three main variations, but we could say that this is sort of a fourth where both legs are straight and they're both stacked. So there's this as well. And the main difference to me between the single leg and the double leg is that when we've got two legs, that backs out some of the hip adduction happening here. So we maybe feel less of that IT band stretch, because this top leg is not as low as it was, it's a little higher when you put that other leg underneath it. So, yeah, that's how I would break down like how to think about the varying leg positions in a twist. If you don't have like a lot of anatomical details that you're thinking about, or like a very specific anatomical focus in your twist, but instead you just kind of want like your basic twist, then I might just, if it were me, I might just do like the two legs, the two knees bent, just because that's kind of like a standard twist. But you can absolutely bring in those other variations, like the single leg, knee bent, or single leg straight, just kind of depending on what you're looking for as far as range of motion and rotation, and also what's happening across the outer hip and the outer thigh as far as a stretch. Now let's look at the common cue we tend to hear in reclined twists, which is to scoot our hips to one side before we twist. So let me just show you what that looks like to get a visual for what we're talking about here. So when we twist, and let's just do the double bent knee variation, we can simply bend the knees and just take the legs over. End of story. That's what's going on. And this is great. But we also often hear, maybe sometimes hear, that we should scoot the hips. See how I just scooted the hips to one side? And we do that before we twist. So if we are taking the legs to the right, so if let's just say for this whole video, the twist is legs to the right, then you would scoot the hips to the left a little bit, then take the legs to the right. So that's this common cue. But like why? Why would we give that cue? Why would we maybe do that in our body? Why would we scooch the hips? So once again, take another look at this visually. So here I am. I'm not going to do the hip scooch. I'm just going to take my legs over. So kind of observe, notice what my body looks like here. Then I'm going to come back. Now I am going to scooch and then take my legs over. I know that this might be kind of subtle to see, but do you see any difference? I know in the big picture it's like it's still just a reclined twist, right? Like what's the big deal? Let me show it to you again. I'm going to exaggerate it now a little bit. So I'm not going to scooch. I'm just going to take the legs over. I'm kind of trying to exaggerate this now. So notice in this twist, notice the relationship between my rib cage. I've got one hand on my rib cage, like on my chest, and then my pelvis here. I've got one hand on the lateral side of my pelvis. So notice this relationship here. And if I were to draw like a straight line from my rib cage down, it does not actually bisect my hand. It's actually like a diagonal line here. Okay. And then I'm going to come back. And that was not scooting the hips. Now I'm going to exaggerate scooting the hips. So I'm going to scoot my hips maybe more than we might normally, but I'm exaggerating it. And now I'll take my legs to the side. Now, take a look with your movement eyes at my body. Do you notice anything different? And does it help if I take one hand onto my rib cage and one hand onto my pelvis? Can you now see that there's actually more of a direct straight line that bypasses right through the hand? So in this variation, I'm more stacked. My rib cage stays directly above the pelvis. So hopefully, I know that that may have been a little tricky to see, especially like on camera and from a distance, but hopefully that kind of maybe subtle difference was apparent. I would first just start off by saying that as a rule in my yoga teaching, I try not to get too nitpicky or too micromanagey with the alignment cues that I give. I'm not sure like the big greater purpose that that serves, so I don't tend to get behind that a lot unless I have really specific goals or intentions in the moment for why I teach it a certain way. So all of that is just to say that I really personally don't think it's a huge deal whether you scoot the hips or whether you don't scoot the hips. Like in the end, I often just kind of want the person to embody the variation that just feels right in their body. And so that like subtle difference may not be something that I nitpick about. But with that said, I do often give the cue to scooch the hips to one side and then take your legs over. But like I would suggest it, but I'm not like gonna get super particular and come around to someone and say like, "You didn't scoot your hips. Like, come back out and scoot your hips." Like, I wouldn't do that. So just admitting that I don't think it's a huge difference. I do think there is a biomechanical difference between the two variations. And so as kind of yoga body geekily minded people, I think it benefits us to understand the difference because, then it helps us learn a little more about the body and movement in general. So, quick review about directions of motion for the spine. We have rotation, which is obviously kind of what twists are focused on. We have spinal rotation, and this is a movement that takes place in what's called the transverse plane of movement. And that's like movement when you look at the body from a bird's eye view. So if you were to look straight down, you would see rotation. That would be obvious to your eye. And then another plane of movement we have is the frontal plane, and that's movement that you can see from either the front or looking straight back. And spine, when it comes to the spine, that would be lateral flexion. So, lateral flexion or side bending is frontal plane movement. So, what I would suggest when it comes to this hip scoot issue in a reclined twist, if we do scooch the hips first and then we take the legs over, like I showed you with my two hands, that ends up in a more stacked relationship between the rib cage and the pelvis. So let me actually, I'm gonna show you that in a seat. So I'm not in the reclined twist now. This is a different relationship to gravity, but just to see if this helps clarify a little bit. So when I do scooch my hips, then I end up in this rotation, this where I've got the rib cage pretty much just stacked right over the pelvis. So like here and here, pretty stacked. But if I don't scoot the hips and if I just take the legs over, I will end up, and again, I'd be on my back. I'm just showing you upright to make this a little clearer. I would be rotated and my rib cage would be shifted off laterally to the side. This is kind of what happens when you don't scoot your hips. So we end up getting, so see how my rib cage is now off to the side relative to the pelvis? It's not like stacked. So that is not a good or bad thing. It's not something that I think is good or bad. But if you're really aiming to just rotate the spine and maybe get a little more range of motion purely in spinal rotation, then I think it makes sense to try to keep that stacking, try to keep this relationship because then you really will just be moving in rotation. Otherwise, you get that rotation with this lateral flexion, and it's just it's less precise spinal rotation. So that's the main difference. Let me show you one more thing about this because I think this helps to visualize it a little more. So when you're on your back, when you take your legs to the side, no matter how you do it, you will always be taking your pelvis and rolling your pelvis across the floor. So, from the position you started, your pelvis is in one place. And then when the legs go to the side, the pelvis will shift forward. It's not in the same place that it was when you started. So, no matter what, when the legs go to the side, the pelvis rolls and scoots forward. So hopefully this, if we apply this, maybe it makes a little more sense. So if we don't pre-adjust by scooting the hips, if we don't scoot the hips and we start with the pelvis stacked underneath the rib cage, then when we take the legs over, the pelvis migrates forward. So here's that kind of lateral movement in the spine that I was talking about. However, if we first scoot the hips back, we're kind of pre-adjusting so that the pelvis starts, back a little bit. Then when we take the legs over, the pelvis does translate forward, but it ends up more in this position where it's stacked right underneath the rib cage. So we get a little more, maybe a little more effective and a little more isolated spinal rotation. So that is the biomechanical difference that I see. And you can decide whether, that matters on a practical level, like whether you offer the cue or practice it this way in your body. But just to kind of demystify like why we might hear that cue in yoga, that's what the scooting the hips cue is about. Now let's take a quick look at the shoulders in reclined twist because I know we do sometimes hear varying cues about what to do with the shoulders in twists. So I'm going to come down into my reclined twist position. And okay, so here we are. Let's see if you can see my two shoulders here. So, one thing that we sometimes hear, and I know people have questions about this, is what's up with like the trailing shoulder? Like I'm twisting my legs to the right, so the left shoulder. Does this shoulder need to be on the floor? So that was a common question, and I just want to point out I actually have a separate YouTube video where I talked specifically about if your shoulder needs to be on the floor. So I won't go too much in depth in this video, but because we're talking recline twist in general, I think it's good to just mention this. So, just to make it quick, no, your opposite shoulder does not need to be on the floor. It's fine if it's floating. And depending on our range of motion in spinal rotation, some people have more, some people have less. If you're not able to rotate, to turn your pelvis relative to the rib cage, if you don't have as much range of motion as someone else, then when you take your legs over to the side, the shoulder may naturally pop up because you just don't have that range. And there's nothing wrong with this. This is totally fine. However, if you just want to feel, like the shoulder is like, quote, supported, so it's not floating there in space, it's not bad biomechanically for it to be floating there in space, but maybe you would just feel that it was more relaxing for you if it was not. So, in that case, you could just take a prop and like place it underneath the legs so that now the legs are not going as far to the floor. That backs you out a little bit. And then maybe that gives you the space to bring that shoulder down. And this can feel nice and relaxing because now the shoulder is down and the legs are grounded. So everything is kind of grounded. So this is one option. And of course, everyone's different. Maybe someone might need more propping than I'm showing here. Maybe two blankets, maybe a bolster, something like that. So that's what's up with the shoulder. It's fine if it's not on the floor. We don't need to insist that it is, but we might like it to be, and in that case, we might want to back out of the twist with the legs. And then another thing about the shoulders is sometimes we will hear cueing around, kind of readjusting the shoulders in the twist. And I sometimes give this cue because I find that it helps me find maybe quote a quote deeper rotation. So sometimes we might hear this is not about the opposite shoulder, but about the same side shoulder. We might hear to kind of lift it a little bit. So I hear this one sometimes. And really, it's not so much about the shoulder by itself needing to lift, but what we'd really kind of want is the rib cage to kind of turn a little bit. And with the rib cage turning, that again rotates the rib cage more relative to the pelvis, and that brings us into more of a rotation. So, I mean, maybe the better cueing for this, if this was like your intention, maybe not so much to like lift the shoulder because then that's all that does. That doesn't really change the spine. So maybe it's kind of just like turn your rib cage so that the right half of the rib cage scoots up a little bit more, like up toward the ceiling, and then the left half of the rib cage descends down a little bit more. And then as the rib cage adjusts, your right shoulder might also move a little bit, but maybe it's not so much about the shoulder, but it's more about the rib cage. But, rib cage and shoulder are connected areas. But that just may be something that you might hear when it comes to recline twist. You may hear cueing around like how to position the shoulders and, what to do, how to adjust. So those are some tips and some things to think about when it comes to really both shoulders in recline twists. That wraps up our look at recline twist alignment cues. I hope you found this clarifying and helpful for your yoga practice or teaching. And if you appreciated this content, subscribe to my channel so you can stay up to date on all of the content that I share.